High in the Andes Mountains, where the air is thin and the peaks cut into the sky like jagged blades, a civilization once dared to build the impossible. The Incas, masters of stone and vision, looked at the cliffs, valleys, and sheer walls of rock around them not as barriers, but as opportunities. To most people, these landscapes would mean danger, avalanches, unstable ground, and the constant risk of falling to death. Yet to the Incas, this was home, and from these cliffs they would carve one of the most extraordinary legacies of human history. The Inca Empire, at its height in the 15th and early 16th centuries, stretched across nearly 2,500 miles of South America. From modern-day Colombia in the north, through Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and down into Chile and Argentina, the Incas ruled the largest empire the Americas had ever seen. They did this without iron tools, without wheels, and without written language in the traditional sense. Yet they left behind cities, fortresses, and road networks so impressive that even today, engineers marvel at how such feats were possible. But of all their wonders, it was their ability to build on cliffs, on edges of mountains where one wrong step meant death, that captured the imagination. Take Machu Picchu, the lost city perched dramatically between two peaks. Or Sacsayhuaman, the fortress above Cusco with walls of stones so massive that modern cranes would struggle to lift them. These were not random constructions. They were precise, deliberate, and resilient against earthquakes and centuries of erosion. The question is, how did the Incas manage this without falling, and without the modern equipment we rely on today? The harsh landscape. To understand their achievement, one must first understand the Andes. These are not gentle mountains. They rise sharply, with cliffs that drop thousands of feet. Earthquakes regularly shake the ground, while landslides and heavy rains erode the soil. Building in such conditions was not just difficult, it was deadly. A single miscalculation could send tons of stone crashing down, taking workers with it. And yet, the Incas thrived here, turning the mountainsides into terraces, farms, and cities. The cliffs also posed another challenge: resources. There were no flat lands where stone could easily be cut and moved. Everything had to be managed in steep terrain, with gravity working against them. While civilizations like the Egyptians built pyramids on deserts and flat plateaus, the Incas were stacking stones on the sides of mountains, often higher than 8,000 feet above sea level. The vision of the rulers. The Inca rulers were not content with simple settlements. Their philosophy of building was tied deeply to their religion and cosmology. To them, the mountains were sacred beings called apis. Living among them and building into their sides was not just practical, it was spiritual. Structures had to blend with nature, respect the gods, and at the same time show the power of the empire. When the emperor, known as the Sapa Inca, ordered a new fortress or city, his vision was clear: it must defy the impossible. The Incas were not only building homes and temples, they were proving their dominion over the natural world. Every stone that clung to a cliffside was a message: we belong here. The mountains are ours. Stone without mortar. What made Inca architecture unique was the way they worked with stone. Unlike many civilizations that used mortar or concrete to glue their buildings together, the Incas relied on ashlar masonry, a technique where stones were cut so precisely that they fit together without any binding material. The stones were carved to interlock like puzzle pieces, with each one balancing perfectly against the others. This method had several advantages. First, it meant that their structures could withstand earthquakes. When the ground shook, the stones shifted slightly but then settled back into place. This flexibility was far superior to rigid mortar walls, which would have cracked and collapsed. Second, the lack of mortar made the walls stronger against time and erosion. Even after centuries, many Inca walls remained standing almost exactly as they were built. But cutting and fitting these stones on cliffs was no easy task. Some of the blocks weighed several tons. Without wheels, without iron chisels, how did the Incas move and shape them? Tools and techniques. The Incas used bronze and stone tools, which might seem primitive compared to modern steel. Yet they were masters of technique. They would pound rocks with harder stones, slowly shaping them over days or weeks. To smooth the edges, they used sand and water as an abrasive. Some archaeologists believe they also used a technique of heating the rock with fire and then cooling it rapidly with water to create cracks that made cutting easier. Transporting these stones was an even greater challenge. The Incas did not have beasts of burden like horses or oxen. Instead, They relied on human labor and llamas, which could carry small loads but not massive blocks. Teams of workers used ropes, levers, and sheer strength to move the stones up steep paths. On cliffs, they may have carved ramps or used wooden scaffolding tied into the mountainside. The fact that they managed this without advanced machinery shows not just their strength, but their organization. The Inca Empire had a unique system called the MITA, a form of labor tax where communities contributed workers for state projects. This allowed the rulers to gather thousands of people for major construction efforts, each person playing a role in the process. Surviving the elements. Building was only half the challenge. The Andes are prone to heavy rains, which can wash away soil and weaken foundations. The Incas solved this with remarkable engineering. They designed terraces, stepped platforms cut into the mountainside, that stabilized the cliffs and created flat surfaces for construction. These terraces were not just for farming, they also prevented landslides and managed water flow. Drainage was another critical innovation. The Incas built hidden channels and fountains into their cities to carry away rainwater. At Machu Picchu, for example, more than 700 drainage structures are integrated into the site. Without them, the city would have washed away long ago. This attention to detail was what made their cliffside cities not just beautiful, but durable. They were built to last, designed with nature rather than against it. A civilization at its peak. By the time the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, the Incas had already proven their mastery of the mountains. Their cities blended seamlessly with the cliffs, their roads stretched across thousands of miles, and their empire thrived in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. To the invaders, it seemed almost supernatural. How could a people with no iron, no wheels, and no written records achieve so much? The answer lay in a combination of vision, engineering brilliance, and the collective effort of thousands of workers who believed in the power of their rulers and the sanctity of their land. Each stone laid on a cliff was both a practical solution and a spiritual statement. The Incas were not simply builders, they were master problem-solvers. To them, every cliff, every slope, every impossible piece of terrain was a puzzle waiting to be solved. Where most civilizations would have avoided the steep mountains of the Andes, the Incas leaned into the challenge, developing methods so advanced that modern engineers still puzzle over their precision. The question remains, how did they make the impossible possible? Precision stonework. At the heart of Inca construction was their unrivaled stonework. Unlike most civilizations that relied heavily on mortar to hold walls together, the Incas developed a method so precise that no cement was necessary. They cut stones to fit together with such accuracy that even today, you cannot slip a single sheet of paper between them. This method is called ashlar masonry. The stones were not uniform in shape, but carefully irregular, each one cut to fit uniquely into the wall. Think of a puzzle, but with no repeated pieces, each stone locked the others into place. Why was this so important? Because the Andes are earthquake country. Mortar walls would crack and collapse under the strain of constant tremors. Inca walls, however, flexed like living things. When the ground shook, the stones shifted slightly, absorbing the shock, and then returned to their locked position. This made their structures earthquake-resistant long before modern engineering developed such principles. The stones themselves were massive, some weighing over 100 tons. At Sacsayhuaman near Cusco, gigantic blocks the size of buses were fitted together seamlessly. It wasn't brute force alone, it was clever engineering. How they cut and shaped stones. The Incas did not have iron or steel tools. Instead, they used stone hammers, bronze chisels, and harder rocks like diorite to pound softer stones into shape. This might sound slow, but patience and precision were their strength. Some historians believe they also used a method of stone cracking. By heating the rock with fire and then rapidly cooling it with water, natural cracks would form, making it easier to split. After shaping, the surfaces were polished with sand and water until they fit perfectly against each other. This wasn't just functional, it was also artistic. The Inca walls curved gently, tapering slightly inward, and aligned beautifully with the landscape. Their buildings were not only strong, but also harmonious with the mountains around them. Transporting the giants. Perhaps the greatest mystery is how they moved such enormous stones up steep mountain terrain. Without wheels, cranes, or large animals, this seems almost impossible. The answer lies in organization and human labor. The Inca Empire operated on a system called the MITA. This was a kind of labor tax, where communities contributed workers for state projects. When a fortress or temple was commissioned, thousands of workers could be gathered from across the empire. The stones were likely dragged using ropes made from tough Andean plants, combined with levers, logs, and ramps. On cliffs, scaffolding and platforms were built, anchored into the rock. Step by step, inch by inch, the stones were hauled into place. Imagine the scene, hundreds of men pulling in rhythm, chanting to keep pace, as ropes strained and logs cracked under the weight. At times, the effort was so great that the workers themselves became legends. In some oral traditions, people who died in these efforts were remembered as sacrifices to the mountain gods. The roads that bound the empire. Building on cliffs wasn't limited to cities, it extended to roads. The Incas created one of the greatest road networks in the ancient world, stretching over 25,000 miles through mountains, deserts, and valleys. These roads were vital for communication, trade, and military movement. But how do you carve roads into mountainsides? Again, the Incas showed genius. They built stone paths, carved stairways directly into cliffs, and even created rope suspension bridges out of woven grass. These bridges spanned deep gorges and were replaced regularly by local communities. For travelers, they were lifelines, though crossing one must have been terrifying. Along the roads were tambos, way stations providing shelter and supplies. This allowed messengers, known as chasquis, to run long distances carrying messages across the empire. Using a relay system, messages could travel hundreds of miles in just a few days, faster than most European systems of the time. Terraces, farms on cliffs. The Incas didn't just build on cliffs, they grew food there too. Their invention of agricultural terraces was revolutionary. By cutting steps into the mountains, they created flat surfaces where crops could grow. Each terrace had its own microclimate, with some designed for potatoes, others for maize, and others for quinoa. The terraces also solved the problem of erosion. Heavy rains would normally wash soil away, but the stepped design stabilized the mountainside. Beneath the soil, layers of gravel and sand acted as drainage, preventing water from pooling and weakening the structure. Some terraces even had irrigation systems fed by mountain springs. Water flowed down through channels carved into the stone, evenly distributed across each level. This transformed barren slopes into lush fields. At places like Ollantaytambo and Pisac, these terraces still stand, some still in use centuries later. They were not just practical, they were works of art, blending seamlessly with the natural curve of the mountains. Water engineering. One of the most overlooked achievements of the Incas was their mastery of water. On steep cliffs, rainwater could destroy foundations, yet the Incas turned this challenge into another triumph. At Machu Picchu, over 700 drainage channels are hidden beneath the city. These carried away rainwater and prevented landslides. In addition, the Incas built fountains and baths, channeling natural springs into their settlements. Water flowed constantly, providing both drinking water and symbolic purification. The fountains were not random, they were aligned with temples and plazas, turning water into a spiritual as well as practical feature. For the Incas, engineering was never separate from religion. Sacred geometry and astronomy. Inca construction was not only functional but also cosmic. Temples and cities were often aligned with the sun, moon, and stars. At Machu Picchu, the Temple of the Sun is positioned so that during the solstices, sunlight passes perfectly through its windows. This was not accidental. The Incas saw themselves as children of the sun, and their architecture reflected their place in the universe. Every stone, every terrace, every alignment was both engineering and devotion. The human factor. Behind all this brilliance was not just technology, but people. Thousands of workers, artisans, architects, and farmers played their part. The Incas had no system of money, but through the MITA, every person contributed labor to the empire. In return, they received protection, food during famine, and shared in the pride of their civilization's achievements. This sense of collective effort made the impossible possible. When we look at the stones on a cliff today, we are not just seeing architecture, we are seeing the fingerprints of countless lives, united by vision and belief. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Andes in the 16th century, they were stunned by what they found. To men who had crossed oceans and fought through jungles, the sight of Inca cities clinging to mountainsides seemed otherworldly. They saw walls of stone that no tool in Europe could replicate, terraces that turned cliffs into farmland, and roads that threaded through impossible terrain. Yet what astonished them most was how these structures had stood firm where the earth itself shook and shifted. While Spanish towns built with mortar often collapsed in earthquakes, Inca cities endured with little damage. It must have seemed as though the very mountains themselves protected their children. Despite this brilliance, the Incas could not withstand the conquest. Disease carried from Europe spread faster than Spanish swords, cutting down millions before battles were even fought. The empire fractured, civil war erupted between rival princes, and when Francisco Pizarro marched into Peru with fewer than 200 men, he found an empire weakened but not broken. The Spaniards took Cusco, the capital, and dismantled much of the Inca elite. Temples were looted, gold was melted down, and the sacred city was remade with colonial churches standing on top of Inca stone foundations. Yet even in defeat, the engineering of the Incas proved indestructible. The Spanish tore down walls but rebuilt their own towns on the same foundations, for they quickly realized the strength of Inca stonework was superior to their own. Many colonial buildings in Cusco today still rest on walls laid by Inca hands. The conquerors erased the religion, but they could not erase the stones. Some cities, however, escaped their gaze. Machu Picchu, high on a hidden ridge, was never discovered by the Spanish. For centuries it lay forgotten, swallowed by jungle, until it was brought to the world's attention in the early 20th century. Its terraces, fountains, and temples, preserved by the mountain mist, became a symbol of Inca genius. When archaeologists first studied it, they marveled at the hidden systems beneath the surface: drainage channels, waterworks, and retaining walls that kept the city stable despite centuries of storms. It was as if the Inca engineers had built not only for their own time but for eternity. The resilience of these structures raises a deeper question. What was their secret? The answer lies not only in stone cutting or terrace building, but in philosophy. The Incas did not seek to dominate nature in the way many later civilizations did. They sought harmony. Mountains were sacred beings, rivers were life-givers, and the sun was the father of all. To build into a mountain was not an act of violence, but of respect. Stones were placed to follow natural contours. Terraces curved with the slope of the land. Cities were planned in shapes that echoed animals and celestial forms, like the puma-shaped layout of Cusco. By working with nature instead of against it, they achieved balance, and balance meant survival. Modern engineers continue to study Inca techniques. Earthquake-resistant walls, water management systems, and agricultural terraces all carry lessons for today's world. In a time when climate change threatens crops and rising populations put pressure on land, the idea of farming on mountain terraces is being reconsidered. In parts of Peru, communities still use ancient terraces, producing food on land that otherwise would be useless. Scientists marvel at the biodiversity of crops nurtured by the Incas: hundreds of varieties of potatoes, maize adapted for high altitudes, and grains like quinoa that thrive where others fail. These were not just survival strategies, they were innovations centuries ahead of their time. But perhaps the greatest legacy lies not in agriculture or architecture, but in resilience. The Incas built for permanence. They did not create structures meant to last a decade or a century. They built with the patience of people who thought in generations. Each stone was a promise to the future. Each terrace was an inheritance. And so, even when their empire fell, their work endured. Long after their names were forgotten, their walls still stood. Travelers who walk through these sites today often describe a strange feeling, as if the stones themselves are alive. Standing at Machu Picchu, gazing at the terraces that cling to cliffs, one feels both awe and humility. It is a reminder that human beings, even without machines, can achieve wonders when guided by vision and collective effort. It is also a reminder that civilizations rise and fall, but what they leave behind can outlast them by centuries. The story of the Incas is not just about how they built on cliffs without falling. It is about how they looked at danger and found opportunity, how they embraced harsh landscapes and turned them into sanctuaries, how they left a mark that not even conquest could erase. Their empire was conquered, their rulers executed, their religion suppressed, but their stones remain, whispering across the centuries. Every terrace, every wall, every hidden water channel tells the same story, that the Incas understood something fundamental. They knew that to live in the Andes was to live with uncertainty, with earthquakes and storms and the constant threat of the mountains. Instead of fearing it, they adapted to it. They designed not for control, but for coexistence. And that is why their work still stands when so much else has crumbled. Today, people from across the world climb those cliffs, walk the narrow stone paths, and marvel at the ingenuity of a people who had no wheels, no iron, and no written books. The mountains that once belonged to the Incas now host tourists and researchers, yet the spirit of the builders lingers. In the silence of the Andes, as mist curls around ancient walls, it feels as though the Incas are still there, watching, waiting, reminding us that greatness is not measured by the tools we hold, but by the vision we carry and the determination to see it through. And so, the cliffs tell their story. Not of death, as one might expect from such dangerous heights, but of life, life carved in stone, life enduring against time, life that whispers from every rock, every terrace, every hidden corner of the mountains. The Incas may have vanished, but their voice remains, echoing across the Andes. We built here, and we still endure.